Hey everyone, this is Sandeep back with another video. And in today's video, I'm going to continue our Spring course series. The link of all the videos, the previous videos, the playlist link is in the description. So you can go and watch the previous videos if you haven't watched. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about bean scope. So let's jump into the video. So I have created a project called bean scope. If you see here, right, in my IntelliJ. Now, until now, like there are so many videos, right? Maybe more than 15 plus videos or 10 plus videos I have created, and we have created so many beans inside Spring using the different annotation. Like we have created beans using bean annotation, then the component annotation. So in the last video, right, where we talked about auto wiring, you have seen like I have my person bean, and inside that person bean, I have a dependency on the address bean, right, which I am auto wiring. So there is a possibility maybe you got a question in your mind. Okay, so when I'm creating a person and when I'm auto wiring a address into that person, every time I'm going to create a person, what is going to happen with the address? Is Spring going to create a single address object or multiple or different address object? And when we are using the component annotation, right, whether this person bean which is created inside Spring context is going to be a single object or multiple object. So there is a possibility you might got these questions in your mind, right? And that's what we are going to discuss, or I'm going to talk about in this video. So let's jump into the notes. Actually, I have created notes directly inside my IntelliJ. So there are 5 different type of bean scope that are there, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them in this video, and probably I'll cover the other 3 in the subsequent videos. So the first one is a singleton scope, the second one is a prototype bean scope, the third is a request, fourth is session, and then the application scope. So we need to see like when we are creating the bean, whether it falls under a singleton scope or prototype scope, or how I can change the scope of the bean when I'm creating objects, or when the Spring is creating or managing objects through all those annotations. So there's one more point, right? I mean, I like we discuss about this, but when we create the web application, right? So we create the controller layer, the service layer, and the DO layer, right? So when there are multiple users, right, who are accessing the application, so there is a question, right? Each user accessing the application, whether we are creating a different controller for them or we are using the same controller. So all of these things will come when we will start building the web application. So with that, I think I'm going to start with the discussion of singleton bean. Okay, so let's talk about singleton bean. Okay, so I have my person.java class created here. It has a component annotation, and it is auto wiring the address also inside this, but I don't think so we need to worry about address for now. Now what I'm going to do, so when I talk about singleton bean scope, that's the default bean scope in Spring. So even if you don't specify, there is something called a scope. Okay, annotation. If you don't specify any scope, still the default scope of your any of the bean created in Spring is a singleton scope. And what is meaning of singleton? Basically, singleton means one object. So it's going to return one object only all the time. So even if I create 2 different person objects, okay, still it is going to return me the same person object with the name of Sandeep. Okay, so I'll show you with the example. So I'll go to my main.java, right? And here I'm going to create 2 different person. So let's say I'll say P1, and I'm going to use the context only, and I'm going to ask context for the person.class. And maybe second time I'll create another person object, P2, and I'll use the context object, and I'll say get bean, and this time I'll try to use the name and then person dot class. Let's try 2 different method. Now I'm going to sys out p1 dot hash code. Okay, and I'm going to s out p2 dot hash code. So to prove my point, right, we need to see whether if they are the same object, right? If I said like Singleton is more about having the every time returning the same object. So Spring is going to create one object only in the Spring context, and that is what it is going to return. So when I am asking for the person bean, it's going to return me the person bean which has created. Here also it is going to return me the same bean, right? So I'm going to save this, and I need to go to bean scope. Let's try to clean and install, and then I'm going to run it. And let's compare the hash code of both the objects. So let's try to run this. Okay, it's asking me again for module. Let me specify. Okay, run. And if you see here, right, both the objects, both the beans P1 and P2 are having the same hash code. So when we do not specify any scope, the default scope is a singleton scope. Let me try to be specific, and I'll specify the bean scope here. So to specify the scope, we can use the scope annotation, and there is something called bean scope. I think beans definition or something. Bean definition dot scope singleton. So I can be specific, and I can specify the scope as a singleton scope. Again, I'm going to do the clean and install. Okay, so let's run main.java. And if you see here, we are still getting the same hash code, means it is the same object. So if you specify the scope annotation or you don't specify the scope annotation, the default scope when Spring create this beans inside Spring context is singleton. Now let's talk about the another idea, couple of ideas basically called the eager instantiation of the bean and the lazy instantiation of the bean. Now, what is the meaning of eager and lazy? So when we create any bean, right? Like I have created this person bean here, and I've created a separate module also for this. So when the Spring will start, right, it's going to create all of these beans for us. So after seeing the component, right, it's going to create the person bean. After seeing the auto wired, it's going to see the Spring is going to create the address bean also. Now, when we run the application, Spring creates all of these beans by default. That is called the eager instantiation of the beans. So by default, the instantiation of the bean happens in an eager way. So that's how the Spring actually creates all the beans at the startup. Now there is another way where you can tell Spring, okay, don't instantiate the bean until I ask for it. But let's first talk about the first example, which is the eager instantiation. I can give you the example for that. So I'm going to print something called sout here. So before accessing the bean, I'm going to just say this as sout. I'll write another sout where I'll say after accessing the bean. Okay, and in between these two sysout, I'm just going to ask for the person bean to my context. So I'll ask for the person dot class, and maybe we can save it into something. So let's say person p1 is equals to this. Now I need to clean it and install. And I'm going to run the application. So you'll see what happens basically, how we are going to see. Okay, I need to put one more thing actually I forgot to put. So I'm going to put into constructor one more system.out.println. Here I'll say person created just to prove my point. Okay, so again we need to do the clean and install. Now let's see the sequence, what happens. Okay, so if I run now, I'm running the application. You see here, right? Person created. So person has already been created by the Spring. Then what happens, then I got before accessing the bin and after accessing the bin. But actually I'm creating the bin here, right? p1 by saying context.getBean percent class. So when you don't specify anything, I don't see any eager annotation here. Actually, I was trying to put that, or maybe I'm typing the spelling wrong. So I don't see anything related to eager. But now say suppose you don't want Spring to create your bean. Okay, when at the startup, you want when I'm going to access the bean, then only create the bean, right? I mean, you must be thinking in that way. So for that purpose, you just need to specify the annotation called a lazy annotation above your bean. So now what is going to happen, now we are going to see before accessing the bean first and then after accessing the bean. Okay. So let me clean. So when I'm going to actually access the bean, then only Spring is going to create that bean for me because I've asked for the lazy instantiation of the bean. So now if I run, see that before accessing the bean, person created after accessing the bean. So in case of eager, Spring creates the bean for me at the startup. If I say lazy, when I'm going to actually access the bean, then only Spring is going to create the bean. Now you must be thinking which one to use when, eager, lazy. I think when we create multiple projects, in Spring, so there will be some project series which I'm going to bring. I think I'll talk more about it at that time, but still I can give you some examples, or some kind of pointers here. So say suppose you have so many beans, right? So many objects you want to create. Obviously, they are getting created inside the memory. So if you're thinking like there are some of the beans which are not going to get used too frequently, right? So in that case, you can make those beans as a lazy beans. Otherwise, I think it's a good idea, always to keep your beans as a eager bean only. I usually keep all of my beans in all of my projects as eager one only, because you run into some issues where you have some dependencies on some of the beans, and if you have kept them as a lazy, then in that case you might get the exception in your application. So it's a good idea, go with the eager one, but in some of the cases maybe you can use the lazy also. So that's the idea of eager and lazy instantiation of the bean. Okay, so now let's talk about the next topic or next scope in Spring, which is called a scope prototype or prototype scope. So by default, the scope in Spring is any bean which we create, right? It has a scope of Singleton. So Spring create one object only. Even you ask for the multiple object using the getBean method, Spring is going to return you one object only. Now, there are some cases maybe you need to have different object created. So whenever you're going to ask for the get bean, Spring is going to create a new object and it's going to return to you. So in that case, you need to change the scope of that particular object or that particular class to called scope prototype. Okay, so I have this person.java, and which is a component, right? And I'm changing its scope to scope prototype. I'll go back to my main.java, and here we are creating two different person object, right? So whenever I'm going to say context.getBean person.class, this is going to create one different p1 object. This is going to create different person object. So we are going to have two different person objects here, and I'm printing the hash code of them. So in the previous example of Singleton, we got the same hash code, and I'm guessing in this case we'll get the different hash code. So let's do the clean, install, and hopefully if this runs, see that we are getting two different hash code. That means Spring has created two different bean object of the person class, because I've said Spring use the scope of scope prototype. Now you must be thinking, right, when to use the Singleton scope and when to use the prototype scope. I think the thumb rule, and mostly I use in my application, mostly we use this Singleton scope only. Sometimes there are cases where you need to use the prototype scope also, but this is very, very rarely used scope, I would say. So I can give you the example, right? Say suppose there is object, right? And there are multiple threads which are accessing that object. Okay, and they're overriding the data at the same time. So what will happen, so one of the thread will win, right? And maybe both the thread will win. So it is called the race condition, right? I don't want to get into a topic of race condition in this video because there's more about scope. So that's what I'm saying, right? So when we create the web application in Spring, we create our controller services and data access object. Mostly they are singleton scope. And sometimes, you need some objects which are mutable. So immutable and mutable. So the objects which are immutable, you can use singleton scope. The object which are going to be mutable, right? You can use the prototype scope. That's the simple idea. But most of the time, we're going to use the singleton scope only. Okay, so I think I covered a lot of topic in this video related to bean scope. We talked about singleton prototype. I talked about the eager and lazy instantiation of the bean and when to use what and all those things, right? So I think I have covered a lot of Spring Core related topics until this video. I think it's a good time we should start creating some applications also. So probably from the next part, I will start creating some of the Spring application and we will jump into the Spring Boot also, right? Spring Boot, Spring MVC and all those things. Because this was Spring Core. I think I've covered a lot of topics related to Spring Core. We have a good foundation now and it's a good idea to start creating some of the application. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to see you in the next video. And there are a lot of videos coming related to full stack application development. So you can stay with me on this channel. And I'm going to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching this video. You take care and goodbye.